It's the week ending Saturday, the 27th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump attending the annual Davos summit in Switzerland, Aung San Suu Kyi accused of lacking moral leadership by a senior US diplomat, and City of London fundraiser, the President's Club, shutting down over reports of sexual harassment. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Arion McNicoll and Mike Starling, and from the week junior, yes, it's Felicity Capon. And starting the show this week, it's Arion. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
So apparently chefs are crying in their kitchens at the Élysée Palace and everywhere in France tonight.
Maybe he could share a little bit about what his philosophy of cooking has been.
C'était du beurre, du vin, de la crème.
At that time it was wine, butter and cream.
Une cuisine généreuse.
A cuisine that is very generous.
Et si vous voulez, une cuisine toujours faite à la perfection.
And a cuisine always done to the perfection.
Renowned French chef Paul Bocuse speaking to the Culinary Institute of America back in 2011. Now, Arion, Bocuse passed away this week.
He did.
He was 91. Tell us about him and why the death of a nonagenarian chef is your story of the week. So
I found myself at a dinner with a French person on the weekend, and they said, "Oh my God, Paul Bocuse has died." And I must confess, I was like, the who? With the what now? But then looking into it, it occurred to me that I was aware of at least his restaurant, L'Auberge, which is one of the longest running 3 Michelin starred restaurants in France. And yeah, the more you hear about him, the more you realise that you do know his work, or many people do. He's regarded as the Pope of French cuisine, and really was one of those people who was instrumental in the rise of the celebrity chef. Increasingly, over the course of his life, chefs came out of the kitchen and onto our TV screens, onto the front of their cookbooks, for better or worse. And really, that transition happened in his lifetime. So his passing was not only, caused this great trauma in France, but was regarded across the culinary world as significant.
So, okay, this isn't just the passing of a great chef then, it's, the end of an era? But it's not the end of the celebrity chef, is it?
No, definitely not. And in fact,
what is it then?
He's unleashed
Why is it your
something.
Story?
Because I think that his existence caused the situation or the attitude that we have to food these days, which is so profoundly changed from what would have existed in the 60s.
Okay, actually, Felicity, you are nodding, so is Mike, so tell me why.
Yeah, well, I think, looking back on his lifetime and seeing over the decades how our relationship to food has changed, it does seem sort of encapsulated almost within his life and his story. He gave this fantastic quote to AP saying, when he first started out as a chef, he said there was rigour. You had to wake up early and milk the cows, feed the pigs, do the laundry and cook. It was a very tough school of hard knocks. Today, the profession has changed enormously. There's no more coal. You push a button and you have heat. And I think that kind of sums it up now. I feel everything about how we treat food and cooking and our relationship to that has completely changed within his lifetime. It's fascinating.
And also the way that we dine. Restaurants used to be quite stuffy affairs, places that you'd wear your best suit and your best dress and you'd go and you'd have a lovely and very expensive meal. And now people's attitude to food is massively changed, or at least eating out.
Food's theatre, isn't it? This is the whole point. And he took it to a business level. That was what I've read about his history and his lifestyle.
Go on, Mike. Give us a fact.
Well, no, he was the first business chef. He went out of the kitchen and took his business mindset of food and took it global, whether it was fine dining or whether it was fast food. And I think when you look at that, if you go to a theatre now, the ones that get the big reviews are the ones that are doing something extraordinary.
And interestingly, you say both fast food and the sort of haute cuisine, high dining stuff. And he did both. He had restaurants both low and high, and global restaurants. He had some in America, some in Asia, some all across Europe. And he really kind of turned himself into a brand, spoke about himself in the third person as well.
But wasn't it also sort of talent and simplicity and understanding that, if you have a chicken, you don't need to do crazy fancy stuff to it. You need to learn how to cook a roast chicken really, really well. Like, there was this huge amount of skill and knowledge about food that I slightly wonder now whether we're losing, actually. And I think we are so obsessed with food. I mean, we talk about it, we Instagram it.
When you say we, I was going to interrupt you the first time you said we, and I thought I'd let you finish your point, but you're doing it again. When you say we, do you actually mean the British? Because French people have always had a respect for food, haven't they? It's British approaches to food, and Australians and Americans and their approach to food that's changed over the past few decades.
Yeah, I mean, Angela Hartnett would say that we still don't have any interest. She was on Desert Island Discs recently, wasn't she? And she sort of said that she declared that we weren't a foodie nation and that we no longer study home economics at school. We aren't taught how to shop or cook properly. So I think that's very interesting. And I also think, I just wanted to mention Instagram, actually, because I think we are now obsessed with how our food looks as opposed to how it tastes. Well, and there is people feel there's no point going to a restaurant and eating something unless it looks absolutely gorgeous and you can Instagram it. And I just wonder whether we're actually coming away from of what Paul Bocuse, sort of his thoughts about food.
Well, I think that he was instrumental in that as well, and his name is associated with Nouvelle Cuisine, which was a challenge to the sort of former haute cuisine, which was all about rich foods and buttery sauces and wine. And Nouvelle Cuisine was about simplicity and presentation, and he later stepped away from some of the excesses of Nouvelle Cuisine because it came to be seen as a bit of a joke that you'd get like 3 peas on a plate, each cut into quarters, and he sort of said that is nonsense and it's not what I'm talking about. But what he talked about was presentation, and that's so massively changed. You look at dishes, even cookbooks from 30 years ago, and the food looks like mush, and
a lot of them didn't even have illustrations or pictures at all, and now I wouldn't be able to buy a cookbook unless it didn't have gorgeous glossy illustrations. I want to see what I'm cooking.
Yeah. Nigel Slater?
I do have
Sparing on the illustrative front. Very good cookbooks. Yeah,
I think that's a sign of a really good cook, is that if you have a recipe book which doesn't have pictures in.
When it comes to Michelin stars, though, like you say, he had a 3 Michelin-starred restaurant and was very much part of the trend that really popularised the idea that if you're a chef, that is what you're aiming at, that is the Oscar of the food industry. Was that actually a useful intervention by Michelin? And we're stuck with it now, but was it?
I think that, the question of whether Michelin stars matter is often asked, and
well, sorry for not being very original.
Yeah, well, but the sort of the counter argument that I read about that is that it matters to chefs, that people's careers are made or broken according to whether they are able to get 1 to 3 stars. Chefs cry, they storm out. It's cause for great celebration or concern when the announcement arrives. On the other hand, you have seen the emergence of different methods of adjudication, including the world's 50 top restaurants, and that's kind of arisen to challenge the primacy and monopoly of the Michelin Guide, which is weird because it's so obscure in how it's and
elitist
decided
as well, in the truest sense of the word, in that the people who are reviewing the restaurants are experts on cuisine, therefore their experience of going to the restaurant isn't the same as mine. If I'm taking my wife out for our anniversary and I'm rarely and unusually spending £100 on a meal, then I'm going to be impressed by most things that a Michelin Guide writer won't be.
Totally. And also historically there's been a real kind of push towards French style of cookery and presentation. So, the Michelin Guide is often queried in terms of its lack of understanding of, say, Asian foods, for example, but it still matters.
People like accolades, though, don't they? I mean, people in every industry. Yeah. My brother's a chef, and he wins awards for his restaurants. And it does make a difference to his business, and he does simplify.
Nice little plug, Mike. What's your brother's restaurants?
The Falcon Steakhouse in Gloucestershire.
Yeah.
And the Rose and Crown in Nintsfield in Gloucestershire.
Excellent. Mention the Week Unwrapped and get a free glass of water.
Other restaurants are available.
But seriously, he talks about, like, he likes watching cookery shows and stuff and reading the history of gastronomy, whether it comes from Bocuse or whether it's Gordon Ramsay, and he likes that, and he does take tips from it. But like he says about Bocuse, I spoke to him about this earlier on regarding this podcast, and he said, in fact, it's because of his simplified recipes butter was his favourite ingredient. My brother likes using butter as well, and that's what he took from his life. But you say you go to a 5-star or a 3-star Michelin restaurant, it's It's about the experience, it's about theatre, it's about the look, it's about the feeling.
Yeah.
Not always about the food.
And I think it still matters to consumers as well, because, you know, you see a Michelin star and you think, well, this is going to be a good place to spend my £100 when I take that, when I want to take someone out for a special meal.
And you said, Felicity, that however you define that, approach to food has changed. One of the things that's changed in the past few years, particularly amongst millennials, is it's not just so much a respect for the ingredients and all the rest of it. It's actually a paranoia about eating things that are too unhealthy, or restricting things from a diet, or going on slightly faddy diets, you know, whether it's gluten-free or whether it's low carb or whatever it is. And it doesn't seem to me like Bocuse had much to do with that.
Yeah, hugely. I think that, you know, our obsession with food now, a huge amount of the proportion of the conversation is now taken up with faddy diets and, you know, cutting out carbs, cutting out fats, eating avocados, getting coconut water. I think we are obsessed.
And the advocates of that would say they have an increased awareness of food, whether you agree with that or not.
I mean, I think there's a lot of pseudoscience, though, so I'm not sure it is an increased knowledge. I think there's definitely an awareness and an obsession, and, you know, quite an unhealthy obsession to start freaking out and cutting out these food groups. I'm not sure it's a real knowledge of what is good for our bodies and what isn't, and I imagine that not much really has changed from, you know, a few decades ago. I mean, I think it's the old ageism, isn't it? Everything in moderation. I think we are obsessed with finding this, you know, one cure fits all, that if I just don't ever eat bread again, I'll be healthy, which just isn't true.
And as you say, Mike, cooked everything in butter, lived to 91.
Fresh produce is the key.
And I mean, the reality is that food trends move on, and even Nouvelle Cuisine has been replaced by the kind of new Nordic and molecular gastronomy of Heston Blumenthal and that lot. But as Anthony Bourdain said, there are a few greats in the world, like Muhammad Ali-style greats, and Bocuse is a great.
Well, I think makes sense to link directly from that to Felicity Capon. What's your story of the week?
The silence surrounding the scariest monster of all.
Imagine feeling like you have no power and no voice. Well, you know what, Larry? I have both power and voice, and I am only beginning to just use them. All these brave women have power, and we will use our voices to make sure you get what you deserve. A life of suffering spent replaying the words delivered by this powerful army of survivors.
Two-time Olympian gymnast Ali Reisman there, confronting the former Olympic doctor Larry Nassar in court last Friday. Felicity, this is a really powerful, charismatic speech, went viral online. At the sentencing of a systematic abuser of young women and girls that took place under the noses of USA Gymnastics. So it is a big story. Do you feel it's being underreported, though?
I think it has been underreported to such an extent, it's absolutely staggering. This former doctor has been referred to as possibly the most prolific child sex abuser in history. Marina Hyde in The Guardian called it the biggest court-proven sex abuse scandal in the history of sport. This is massive. This is a serial offender who has over 150 victims, and his sentence last week, he's looking at between 40 to 150 years now in prison. It's a massive case, probably one of the biggest in the history of sport, and it has just flown completely under the radar. I mean, I was looking through the papers this morning. The Times has this tiny column on page 35 of World News. None of the newspapers had it on its front cover at all. It's staggering because actually the protagonists are former Olympians. You know, these are at the top of their very game. They have performed all over the world, gold medals everywhere, and have suffered this absolutely horrific abuse. Why aren't we talking about this more?
Okay, I mean, Mike, one reason, perhaps, that we aren't talking about it as much, just to take it as a news story and just leaving aside the horrors of the abuse for a moment, might be that it is gymnastics and not football and not cricket and not rugby and not even tennis.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you look at it from the American media sort of point of view, where obviously the British media would take the lead of what's happening in America on the news agenda, USA Gymnastics is a massive thing for them. But perfectly honest, the big time when British media really took on this story was when Simone Biles came out on Twitter and had her say.
And who's Simone Biles?
She was the golden girl of Rio.
What's interesting about Simone Biles is that she only entered the whole thing, I think it was last week.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is a story that has been around in some form since 2016.
Okay, so gymnastics is a big deal in the US, but they're not reporting it there either, is what you're saying, basically.
Yeah, I think that they are reporting it now, since it needed a golden girl or to come out to say something. That's just... It's just a situation.
So if it isn't to do with the prominence of the sport then, Felicity, why do you think it is being underreported?
Because I still think we live in a society where young girls aren't believed. And I think you see that across in many different cases and stories. And the sad thing is, if you have a male in a position of authority as a doctor, he was a respected doctor, and you have a bunch of teenage girls who are saying things, the reality is they're not going to be believed. And that's why a lot of them have said...
But this is, he's seeing these statements as part of his plea.
I think he saw that it was snowballing and that
Sure, but it's not a case of not believing the victims now. He's pleading guilty. They're giving their statements in front of him.
But when you think how long this has been going on for, I think it was... Rachel Den Hollander, she was a former club gymnast and she hesitated to contact the police for more than a decade and a half. She said, and I quote, "I was 100% confident that I would not be believed." And I think you see this across the board. You see it with the recent John Warboys case where his victims weren't believed. You have police on tape calling him with his first name and engaging in banter, dismissing the victims as drunks or drug addicts. It's just still the case that it's all stacked against you. If you want to make a complaint, you've got a real tough time proving it.
To flip that on its head, though, Arion, could it actually be, rather than people, not wanting to believe, could it actually be that the public assume this is happening and therefore it isn't news? We now assume that anyone who works with young people in any field, there's a good chance that if you're a sexual predator, that might be a field you choose to go and work in, whether it's a football coach or a priest.
Oh gosh, that's a really concerning thought.
Is it not what you think, though? It's not. It's horrific, but it's not a surprise, is it, that someone who coaches legions of young people or is a doctor to them might have this predilection? That out of thousands of people in that industry, maybe one of them would be into this.
Yeah, maybe. One of the really just horrific details of the testimony that we heard from a number of the girls and women was that they said that one of the problems for them was that they didn't even realize that they were being abused quite a lot of the time, because they were going to a doctor and this was the person who was approved by so many different organizations and sides of the sport that and had the authority that we all think of doctors holding, and even the stuff that he was doing to them, they didn't understand as abuse.
And
so
in some cases, their parents were in the room while he was carrying out the abuse.
So you're right. In a sense, he found himself in the perfect position for doing the awful things that he was doing. As for whether that's something that people just assume is going on, I don't know that people do they?
What I mean is, news is only news because we didn't think it was happening, right? So car bombs going off in Kabul, not news compared to a car bomb going off in Chicago. That's just the fact of the news cycle, right? So from that point of view, you're not surprised to see this kind of endemic abuse anymore, sadly.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's part of the reason it has flown under the radar, is that the abuse of women is normalised in our society, that this is somehow that isn't that shocking because it goes on. And I think there's also it is a gender imbalance, because when you have stories about young boys being abused, young footballers being abused by their coaches, which has recently been in the news, I think that is far more shocking, because it gets far bigger headlines because people somehow find the abuse of boys by men far more distressing or bigger news than girls. I think we do probably think that's going on a lot more.
I think that might have been because you were seeing grown men coming out and talking about having been abused as children and how it had affected them in a way that men tend not to do in the public eye as often as women, despite the fact that very few women victims also come out and talk about it.
Yeah, quite possibly. But I also think that there were so many women in this case who just didn't feel that they could come out, but more not because it was some macho thing where I can't talk about this, but just because they just knew flat out they weren't going to be believed, which is, it's both pretty awful.
I suppose one of the extraordinary things about the clip we played as well from Reisman is she is actually still quite young, isn't she? 23 or something. So what's unusual as well, I think, in this is to see such stirring testimony from someone who's, I've seen sort of 70, 80, 90-year-old Holocaust survivors confronting Nazis. I've not seen someone who's in their 20s, it's only a few years later, standing up and saying, I will not stand for what you did to me, face to face to someone like that.
It's just, that's another thing. It's just so powerful. You've had 4 days of hundreds of women and girls coming forward. You've had a parent who's had to speak on behalf of her child who committed suicide. And what the bravery and the courage to face him and to say the things they've said. And it's not just him. They're taking on everyone. They're taking on USA Gymnastics, Michigan State, the US Olympic Committee. They will not not rest until all the enablers, everyone who made this absolutely horrific scandal, have been brought to justice. It's incredible.
This is the issue now, looking forward with this story, is the stakeholder. It's the stakeholders that are involved in this incident or situation. Like you say, USA Gymnastics, Olympic body for America, a huge university. You got the National College Association as well. They're doing their own investigation, and also just looking back at the previous investigations by other newspapers. Indianapolis Star, for example, in 2016, they did a huge investigation into it. And they uncovered so much stuff and nothing ever got done. There was like the actual complaints against other coaches.
Yeah, but
I
think they did kick it. I think it is, in a way, it's a victory for investigative journalism.
Absolutely.
Because that's how it all started, isn't it? It was a smallish newspaper who got the story and ran with it.
And as The Guardian said, this sentencing isn't the end of this story, it's the beginning. And we're going to see the unfolding of this case across the organisations that were involved in killing off the story, just increasingly become the story themselves.
And from that point of view, I suppose you're right that it will be a turning point, even if it has been underreported this week. Mike, you're last this week. What do you think it'll be remembered for?
The heat is on for the tennis elite.
In my opinion, that is not safe enough sometimes, Have been very, very tough conditions yesterday and today. Sometimes it's too much and can become a little bit dangerous for health. So that's the real thing. It's not nice to see players suffering that much on court. But there is one positive thing, only one, that was not humidity. Still very tough, but in my opinion is tougher, for example, Rio de Janeiro than here.
Rafael Nadal speaking at the Australian Open Tennis Championship this week. So Mike, it's too hot.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's a professional athlete. Can't he cope? I mean, how hot are we talking?
Well, we're talking about 100 degrees on court. About 38, 39 it was a couple of days last week, and they're actually expecting that for the finals this weekend. I mean, looking at devil's advocate, people are going to say, oh, it's the same for both players and it's the same for all players. But personally, I think the extreme heat there has been really extreme this year, and it's only ever going to get worse as time goes on. I think the main... Looking at people like Rafa Nadal and Gael Monfils, who actually his quote was, "I was dying on court" against Novak Djokovic. I mean, when these are world class elite sports people, if they can't be elite because of conditions such as the weather, I think it's a cause for concern.
So was it noticeably less entertaining to watch those matches than it would have been otherwise?
Absolutely. I mean, these guys are 100% running around the court, and if they're there after one set having to have like cold towels put on them, doctors taking blood pressure and all that, I mean, that's got to be a concern for just sports anyway.
But you still watched it, though. Entertaining enough?
Entertaining, because sports entertaining, but knowing that the players aren't playing to their full potential is not a good thing.
But I wonder whether it does actually add to the kind of drama and the entertainment. I mean,
it's like slippery surfaces at the Grand Prix, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's also this kind of, the exhaustion and the bad tempers. It's like watching some weird like gladiator match in Roman times. It's like how much pain can we inflict on them until they start to crumble? And if they suddenly do have to go for a cool towel or something, it's like, ooh, who's gonna?
But the other thing about this story is that the ball boys were affected. The fans were getting affected.
But I bet the fans would have been outraged if the matches had been cancelled equally. So I don't think you can win with the fans.
But what if someone had collapsed?
I'm surely, Arion, the solution is not to invite anyone to Australia to play sport ever.
Maybe that is the only solution. Nobody go to Australia. I think that there is a real sort of, exactly as you were saying, Felicity, there's this sort of fetishization of overcoming the elements and difficulty on your way to victory. The marathon runner who runs through 50-degree heat, or the NFL star who plays in the snow, in 3 feet of snow and wins the Super Bowl. But I think where it becomes an issue is when it's going to be damaging to the health of the people playing it. And Mike, you've spoken in the past about the fact that tennis is a really long and demanding year for players. They get off the cycle of one season, as it were, of tennis, and they're straight back into it again. And I think there is a real concern about how long you can push people in temperatures of various kinds before they break. I
just think for the Grand Slams, there's only 4 every year. With Australia having the first one at this early stage in the height of their summer, why can't they just move it a couple of weeks, 3 weeks down the line? because it is a Grand Slam and there's mega money on.
Well, what's the answer to that? I mean, that must be a question that is being asked.
Yeah, I mean, but it's to do with the calendar. I mean, every part of the world wants their big tennis tournaments, and they want more. If Novak Djokovic could play 6 days in a row, they would want him to.
And I think that there's a kind of a pride in being first or last in the Grand Slam.
What about doing with extreme heat what Wimbledon does with rain, effectively? You know, I mean, if it gets too much, just postpone the match for a bit or play at night.
This is it. The Australian Open does have an extreme heat policy, but on that...
Does it involve Cliff Richard coming out to play?
No, it doesn't. But it's up to the referee to decide if the players cannot continue. And they carried on, and they are going to review it. I just think that whether it's 38 or 40, I mean...
Isn't the point is that it's an outdoor event? So
Absolutely.
the idea that you'd suddenly put it under a cover, doesn't that detract from the whole experience?
I mean, it's always going to be this is the organisers all said that it's always going to be an outdoor event. They're not going to cover up.
But you could play at 7 p.m, couldn't you, rather than 2 p.m?
They do that. So that the finals will be the Australian evening.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, it's actually a great time for TV viewers. Mm-hmm. But it's those first round games which are starting at midday Melbourne
and the pressure for that is simply that there's too many to fit in to diarise. Yeah.
I just think they could move it maybe a month down the schedule and just rearrange, just so if it is if a Grand Slam is have so much money involved and such prestige, give the players a chance.
Okay, but is it a turning point or not? I mean, do you think actually in a year's time they will be having that conversation again, or do you think something? Well,
just look at the actual other sports. I mean, we were talking earlier about the Athens Marathon. Paula Radcliffe, she pulled out with 4 miles to go because of the heat there. I mean, any Olympics that's held on the Mediterranean or held on the equator can be an issue for heat. Qatar World Cup is the big one.
Yeah.
That changed to November.
That's been resolved, hasn't it? That's now winter.
That is going to be November and December.
2022. But it took like years ahead of time to negotiate.
Well, they won it on a summer bid originally, and that was the big talking point.
But athletes can train for these conditions,
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
So surely the best athletes will have trained and will be able to put up with this heat.
They can.
Get on with it.
Yes. Get on with it. Thank you, Felicity. Loving a bit of that. So if Qatar, albeit with a lot more notice, were able to renegotiate when they were holding their tournament with all the international players and all the commercial sponsors and everything else, they could do the same, couldn't they, with an Australian Grand Slam?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, if you look at Qatar, there's no way those players could have played at the height of summer in the Middle East and the Gulf region. But to grow the sports, they do need to have World Cups in different regions because that's only fair. But
have to go to the Australian outbacks.
We don't have any sport. That's interest in it, and it hardly registers.
I think the Australian Open. I think eventually it might not be next year, but I think if you look 10 years down the line, I think we'll see it a bit further down. Say in February, have a few more warm-up tournaments, and just rejig the whole calendar.
I mean, that said, the reason that FIFA were able to massively disrupt the national competitions of pretty much every football playing country on earth so as to be able to cater to the fact that they'd given the bid to Qatar was because they'd done this thing that looked pretty dodgy in giving it to this country in the first place. So, I mean, there's sort of a political element that went on there, and that political element doesn't exist in tennis with the location of Australia, like the Australian Open on the calendar. So I don't know if that's going to mean that it's harder for that to switch around.
And to Felicity's point, I mean, there are 4 Grand Slams a year, as you say. So what if one of the 4, instead of it being Nadal and Djokovic and Murray, what about it's a player who is particularly good in the heat, maybe a player from another part of the world where it's hotter? That would be good for the sport, wouldn't
it? I just think as a business and as an event for the event organisers, and the fans. The other thing, I've sat in stadiums when it's been boiling hot and it's horrific. And
but wouldn't it be exciting to watch, a Somalian tennis player win?
Maybe.
Because they're better in the conditions.
But I do believe that the players are under threat from the heat conditions in Melbourne.
And Arion, as our resident Australian representative, don't you think they just need to swallow this one and say, actually, this is all about our desire to go first. It's not about what's best for the players. We can have our Grand Slam in Australia. We should just do it in winter and not be first.
No, Australia should be first in all things.
Right, resolve that. That's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Mike Starling, Felicity Capon and Ambassador Arion McNicoll. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Week Day, or you can have the magazine delivered direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. Oh, and speaking of subscribing, if this is your first ever taste of this podcast, well, you should know you can get every single episode as soon as it's published straight to your phone. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on Apple Podcasts or Pocket Casts or any number of other audio services. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.